usual intention setting, space clearing ritual. And this book is called The Shuttle by Frances Hodgson Burnett, who wrote The Secret Garden. This book was published in 1907. Not sure if you'll be able to see it. You may have to zoom in a little bit, but it's copyrighted 1907, and is about a rich, wealthy American New York heiress and a British nobleman, aristocratic nobleman who is broke, basically, in financial trouble, which was actually quite a popular thing to do, apparently, for these British aristocrats to go to America to find a rich heiress to marry to help them financially. So it's likely she was inspired by the gossipy news articles in the newspapers about the various families, one of them being the Marlborough, for example. And this is actually very Downton Abbey, right? So I thought that was pretty cool. This is a relic of that time, quite literally. So as usual, we will start with our intention setting, space clearing ritual, and then we'll get into the story. So, without further ado, sit back, sit back, sit back, close your eyes, close your eyes, close your eyes, and relax, So we'll go ahead and start with our intention setting. let's go ahead and take some deep breaths and inhale that lavender scent. Very good. Alright, next we'll go ahead and do our smoke cleanse. Sorry if you guys can hear some of the white noise in the background. I guess I shouldn't say I'm sorry, but you probably will hear some white noise in the background. I will do my best to cut it out for the videos that don't have music. Do the best we can. So thank you so much for watching my video. I'm so glad that you like to watch them. it wove, the might of it, and its place in the making of a world's history, men thought but little of either web or weaving, calling them by other names and lighter ones for the time, unconscious of the strength of the thread, thrown across thousands of miles of leaping, heaving, gray or blue ocean. Fate and life planned the weaving, and it seemed mere circumstance which guided the shuttle to and fro between two worlds divided by a gulf broader and deeper than the thousands of miles of salt, a fierce sea, the gulf of a bitter quarrel deepened by hatred and the shedding of brothers' blood. Between the two worlds of east and west there was no will to draw nearer, each held apart. Those who had rebelled against that which their souls called tyranny, having struggled madly and shed blood in tearing themselves free, turned stern backs upon their unconquered enemies, broke all cords that bound them to the past, flinging off ties of name, kinship, and rank, beginning with fierce disdain a new life. Those who, being rebelled against, found the rebels too passionate in their determination and too desperate in their defense of their strongholds to be less than unconquerable, sailed back haughtily to the world which seemed so far the greater power. Plunging into new battles, they added new conquests and splendor to their land, looking back with something of contempt to the savage West, left to build its own civilization without other aid than the strength of its own strong right hand and strong uncultured brain. But while the two worlds held apart, the shuttle, weaving slowly in the great hand of fate, drew them closer and held them firm, each of them all unknowing for many a year that what had at first been mere threads of gossamer was forming a web whose strength in time none could compute, whose severance could be accomplished but by tragedy and convulsion. The weaving was but in its early and slow-moving years when the story opens. Steamers crossed and recrossed the Atlantic, but they accomplished the journey at leisure and with heavy rollings and all such discomforts as small craft can afford. Their staterooms and decks were not crowded with people to whom the voyage was a mere incident, in many cases a yearly one. A crossing in those days was an event. It was planned seriously, long thought of, discussed and rediscussed with and among the various members of the family to which the voyager belonged. A certain boldness, bordering on recklessness, was almost to be presupposed in the individual who, turning his back upon New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and like cities, turned his face towards Europe. In those days when the shuttle wove at leisure, a man did not lightly run over to London or Paris or Berlin. He gravely went to Europe. The journey being likely to be made once in a lifetime, the traveler's intention was to see as much as possible, to visit as many cities, cathedrals, ruins, galleries, as his time and purse would allow. People who could speak with any degree of familiarity of Hyde Park, the Champs-Élysées, the Pincio, had gained a certain dignity. The ability to touch with an intimate bearing upon such localities was a raison d'être for being asked out to tea or to dinner. To possess photographs and relics was to be of interest, to have seen European celebrities even at a distance, to have wandered about the outside of poets' gardens and philosophers' houses was to be entitled to respect. The period was a far cry from the time when the shuttle, having shot to and fro, faster and faster, week by week, month by month, weaving new threads into its web each year, has woven warp and woof until they bind far shore to shore. It was in comparatively early days that the first thread we follow was woven into the web. Many such have been woven since and have added greater strength than any others, twining the cord of sex and home building and race bounding. But this was a slight and weak one, being only the thread of the life of one of Reuben Vanderpool's daughters, the pretty little simple one whose name was Rosalie. They were the Vanderpools of the Americans, whose fortunes were a portion of the history of their country. The building of these fortunes had been a part of, or had created, epochs and crises. Their millions could scarcely be regarded as private property. Newspapers bandied them about, so to speak, employing them as factors in argument, using them as figures of speech, incorporating them into methods of calculation. Literate touched upon them. Moral systems considered them stories for the young, treated them gravely as illustrative. The first Reuben Vanderpool, who in early days of danger had traded with natives for the pelts of wild animals, was the lauded hero of stories of thrift and enterprise. Throughout his hard-working life, he had been irresistibly impelled to action by an absolute genius of commerce, expressing itself at the outset by the exhibition of courage in mere exchange and barter. An alert power to perceive the potential value of things and the possible malleability of men and circumstances had stood him in marvelous good stead. He had bought at low prices things which were in the eyes of the less discerning worthless, but having obtained possession of such things, the less discerning had almost invariably awakened to the fact that in his hands values increased and methods of remunerative disposition being sought were found. Nothing remained unutilizable. The practical, sordid, uneducated little man developed the power to create demand for his own supplies. If he was betrayed into an error, he quickly retrieved it. He could live upon nothing and consequently could travel anywhere in search of such things as he desired. He could barely read and write and could not spell, but he was daring and astute. His untaught brain was that of a financier. His blood burned with the fever of but one desire. The desire to accumulate money expressed to his nature, not expenditure but investment in such small or large properties as could be resold at profit in the near or far future. The future held fascinations for him. He bought nothing for his own pleasure or comfort, nothing which could not be sold and bartered again. He married a woman who was a trader's daughter and shared his passion for gain. She was of north of England blood, her father having been a hard-fisted small tradesman in an unimportant town who had been daring enough to emigrate when emigration meant that the facing of the unknown dangers in a half-savage land. She had excited Reuben Vanderpool's admiration by taking off her petticoat one bitter winter's day to sell it to a squaw in exchange for an ornament for which she chanced to know another squaw would pay the skin with a skin of value. The first Mrs. Vanderpool was as wonderful as her husband. They were both wonderful. They were the founders of the fortune which a century and a half later was the delight, in fact, the piece de resistance of New York society reporters, its enormity being restated in round figures when a blank space must be filled up. The method of statement lent itself to infinite variety and was always interesting to a particular class, some elements of which felt it encouraging to be assured that so much money could be a personal possession, some elements feeling the fact that an additional argument to be used against the infamy of monopoly. The first Reuben Vanderpool transmitted to his son his accumulations and his fever for gain. He had but one child. The second Reuben built upon the foundation this afforded him a fortune much larger than the first, as the rapid growth and increasing capabilities of the country gave him enlarging opportunities to acquire. It was no longer necessary to deal with the natives. His powers were called upon to cope with those of white men who came to a new country to struggle for livelihood and fortune. Some were shrewd, some were desperate, some were dishonest. But shrewdness never outwitted, desperation never overcame, dishonesty never deceived the second Reuben Vanderpool. Each characteristic ended by adapting itself to its own purpose and qualities, and as a result of each, it was he who in any business transaction was the gainer. It was the common saying that the Vanderpools were possessed of a money-making spell. Their spell lay in their entire mental and physical absorption within one idea. Their peculiarity was not so much that they wished to be rich, as that nature itself impelled them to collect wealth as the lodestone draws towards it iron. Having possessed nothing, they became rich. Having become rich, they became richer. Having founded their fortunes on small schemes, they increased them by enormous ones. In time, they attained that omnipotence of wealth which it would seem no circumstance can control or limit. The first Reuben Vanderpool could not spell, the second could, the third was as well educated as a man could be whose sole To the farthest point of the Rocky Mountains, the number of dollars this mansion, it was always called so, had cost was known. There may have existed Pueblo Indians who had heard rumors of the price of it. All the shopkeepers and farmers in the United States had read newspaper descriptions of its furnishings and knew the value of the brocade which hung in the bedrooms and boudoirs of the Misses Vanderpool. It was a fact much cherished that Miss Rosalie's bath was of Carrara marble, and to good souls actively engaged in doing their own washing in small New England or Western towns, it was a distinct luxury to be aware that the water in the Carrara marble bath was perfumed with Florentine iris. Circumstances such as these seemed to become personal possessions and even to lighten somewhat the burden of toil. Rosalie Vanderpool married an Englishman of title, and part of the story of her married life forms my prologue. Hers was of the early international marriages, and the Republican mind had not yet adjusted itself to all that such alliances might imply. Was yet ingenious, imaginative, and confiding in such matters. Baronetcy and a manor house reigning over an old English village, and over villagers in possible smock frocks, presented elements of picturesque dignity to people whose intimacy with such allurements had been limited by the novels of Miss Oliphant and other writers. The most ordinary little anecdotes in which vicarages, gamekeepers, and dowagers were exciting in these early days. Sir Nigel Anstruthers, when engraved upon a visiting card, wore an air of distinction almost startling. Sir Nigel himself was not as picturesque as his name, though he was not entirely without attraction when, for reasons of his own, he chose to aim at agreeableness of bearing. He was a man with a good figure and a good voice, and but for heaviness of feature, the result of objectionable living might have given the impression of being better looking than he really was. New York laid amused and at the same time charmed to stress upon the fact that he spoke with an English accent. His enunciation was in fact clear-cut and treated his vowels well. He was a man who observed with an air of accustomed punctiliousness and social rules and courtesies as he deemed it expedient to consider. An astute worldling had remarked that he was at once more ceremonious and more casual in his manner than men bred in America. If you invite him to dinner, the worldling said, or if you die, or marry, or meet with an accident, his notes of condolences or congratulations are prompt and civil, but the actual truth is that he cares nothing whatever about you or your relations, and if you don't please him, he does not hesitate to sulk or be astonishingly rude, which last an American does not allow himself to be, as a rule. By many people, Sir Nigel was not analyzed, but accepted. He was of early English who came to New York, and was a novelty of interest with his background of manor house and village and old family name. He was very much talked of at vivacious ladies' luncheon parties. He was very much talked to at equally vivacious afternoon teas. At dinner parties he was furtively watched a good deal, but after dinner, when he sat with the men over their wine, he was not popular. He was not perhaps exactly disliked, but men whose chief interest at that period lay in stocks and railroads did not find conversation easy with a man whose sole occupation had been the shooting of birds and the hunting of foxes, when he was not absolutely loitering about London with his time on his hands. The stories he told, and they were few, were chiefly anecdotes whose points gained their humor by the fact that a man was a comically bad shot or bad rider, and either peppered a gamekeeper or was thrown into a ditch when his horse went over a hedge, and such relations did not increase in the poignancy of their interest by being filtered through brains accustomed to applying their powers to problems of speculation and commerce. He was not so dull but that he perceived at an early stage of his visit to New York, which was probably the reason of the infrequency of his stories. He, on his side, was naturally not quick to rise to the humor of a big deal or a big blunder made on Wall Street, or to the wit of jokes concerning them. Upon the whole, he would have been glad to have understood such matters more clearly. His circumstances were such as had at last forced him to contemplate the Marquis Stornham Court in a state of ruin, the estate going to the dogs, the farmhouse is tumbling to pieces, and he, so to speak, without a sixpence to bless himself with, and head over heels in debt, Englishman of the rank which in bygone times had not associated itself with potentialities as factors possibly to be made useful by the aristocracy. Countesses had not yet spiritedly opened milliners' shops, nor belted earls adorned the stage, but certain noblemen had dallied with beer and coquetted with stocks. One of the first commercial developments had been the discovery of America, particularly of New York, as a place where, if one could make up one's mind to the plunge, one might marry one's sons profitably. At the outset, it presented a field so promising as to lead to rashness and indiscretion on the part of persons not given to analysis in character, and in consequence relying too serenely upon an ingeniousness which rather speedily revealed that it had its limits, ingeniousness combining itself with remarkable alertness of perception on occasion is rather American than English, and is therefore to the English mind misleading. At first, younger sons who gave trouble to their families were sent out, their names, their backgrounds of castles or manors, relatives of distinction, London seasons, fox hunting, Buckingham Palace, and Goodwood races formed a picturesque allurement. That the castles and manors would belong to their elder brothers, that the relatives of distinction did not encourage intimacy with swarms of the younger branches of their families. That London seasons, hunting, and racing were for their elders and betters, were facts not realized in all of their importance by the Republican mind. In the course of time they were realized to the full, but in Rosalie Vanderpool's 19th year they covered what was at that time almost unknown territory. One may rest assured Sir Nigel Anstruthers said nothing whatsoever in New York of an interview he had had before sailing with an intensely disagreeable great-aunt, who was the wife of a bishop. She was a horrible old woman with a broad face, blunt features, and a raucous voice, whose tones added acridity to her observations. When she was indulging in her favorite pastime of interfering with the business of her acquaintances and relations. "I do not know what you are going chasing off to America for, Nigel," she commented. "You can't afford it, and it is perfectly ridiculous of you to take it upon yourself to travel for pleasure as if you were a man of means, instead of being in such a state of pocket that Maria tells me you cannot pay your tailor. Neither the bishop nor I can do anything for you, and I hope you don't expect it. All I can hope is that you know yourself what you are going to America in search of, and that is something more practical than buffaloes. You had better stop in New York. Those big shopkeepers' daughters are enormously rich, they say, and they are immensely pleased by attentions from men of your class. They say they'll marry anything if it has an aunt or grandmother with a title. You can mention the Marchioness, you know. You need not refer to the fact that she thought your father a blackguard and your mother an interloper, and that you have never been invited to Broadmere since you were born. You can refer casually to me and to the bishop and to the palace, too. A palace, even at Bishop's, ought to go a long way with Americans. They will think it is something royal." She ended her remarks with one of her most insulting snorts of laughter, and Sir Nigel became dark red and looked as if he would like to knock her down. It was not, however, her sentiments which were particularly revolting to him. If she had expressed them in a manner more flattering to himself, he would have felt that there was a good deal to be said for them. In fact, he had put the same thing to himself some time previously, and in summing up the American matter, had reached certain thrifty decisions. The impulse to knock her down surged within him solely because he had a brutally bad temper when his vanity was insulted, and he was furious at her impudence in speaking to him as if he were a villager out of work whom she was at liberty to bully and lecture. "For a woman who is supposed to have been born of gentle people," he said to his mother afterwards, "Aunt Marian is the most vulgar old beast I have ever beheld. She has the taste of a female costermonger," which was entirely true. But it might be added that his own was no better, and his points of view Rosalie Vanderpool knew nothing of this side of the matter. She had been a petted butterfly child who had been pretty and admired and indulged from her infancy. She had grown up into a petted butterfly girl, pretty and admired and surrounded by inordinate luxury. Her world had been made up of good-natured, lavish friends and relations who enjoyed themselves and felt a delight in her girlish toilets and triumphs. She had spent her one season of Belgium in being whirled from festivity to festivity and dancing in rooms festooned with thousands of dollars worth of flowers, in lunching or dining at tables loaded with roses and violets and orchids, from which ballrooms or feasts she had worn away wonderful favors and gifts, whose prices, being recorded in the newspapers, caused a thrill of delight or envy to pass over the land. She was a slim little creature with quantities of light feathery hair, like a French doll's. She had small hands and small feet and a small waist, a small brain also, it must be admitted, but she was an innocent, sweet-tempered girl with a childlike simpleness of mind. In fine, she was exactly the girl to find Sir Nigel's domineering temperament at once imposing and attractive, so long as it was cloaked by the ceremonies of external good breeding. Her sister Bettina, who was still a child, was of a stronger and less susceptible nature. Betty, at 8, had long legs and a square but delicate small face. Her well-opened steel-blue eyes were noticeable for rather extravagant ink-black lashes, and a straight young stare which seemed to accuse if not to condemn. She was being educated at a ruinously expensive school with a number of other inordinately rich little girls who were all too wonderfully dressed and too lavishly supplied with pocket money. The school considered itself especially refined and select, but was in fact interestingly vulgar. The inordinately rich little girls, who had most of them pretty and spiritual or pretty and piquant faces, ate a great many bonbons and chattered a great deal in high, unmodulated voices about the parties their sisters and other relatives went to, and the dresses they wore. Some of them were nice little souls who in the future would emerge from their chrysalis state enchanting women, but they used colloquialisms freely and had an indigenous habit of referring to the prices of things. Bettina Vanderpool, who was the richest and cleverest and most promisingly handsome among them, was colloquial to slingies, but she had a deep and mellow child voice and an amazing carriage. She could not endure Sir Nigel Anstruther's, and being an American child did not hesitate to express herself with force, if with some crudeness. "He's a hateful thing," she said. "I loathe him. He's stuck up, and he thinks you are afraid of him, and he likes it." Sir Nigel had known only English children, little girls who lived in the discreet corner of their parents' town or country houses known as the schoolroom, apparently emerging only for daily walks with governesses, girls with long hair and boys in little high hats and with faces which seemed curiously made to match them. Both boys and girls were decently kept out of the way, and not in the least dwelt on, except when brought out for inspection during the holidays and taken to the pantomime. Sir Nigel had not realized that an American child was an absolute factor to be counted with, and a youngster who entered the drawing-room when she chose and joined fearlessly in adult conversation was an element he considered annoying. It was quite true that Bettina talked too much and too readily at times, but it had not been explained to her that the opinions of 8 years are not always of absorbing interest to the mature. It was also true that Sir Nigel was a great fool for interfering with what was clearly no affair of his in such a manner as would have made him an enemy, even had not the child's instinct arrayed her against him at the outset. "You American youngsters are too cheeky," he said on one of the occasions when Betty had talked too much. "If you were my sister and lived in Stornham Court, you would be learning lessons in the schoolroom and wearing a pinafore. Nobody ever saw my sister Emily when she was your age." "Well, I'm not your sister Emily," retorted Betty, "and I guess I'm glad of it." It was rather impudent of her, but it must be confessed that she was not infrequently rather impudent in a rude little girl way, but she was serenely unconscious of the fact. Sir Nigel flushed darkly and laughed a short, unpleasant laugh. "If she had been his sister Emily, she would have fared ill at the moment, for his villainous temper would have got the better of him. I guess that I may be congratulated too, he sneered. If I was going to meet anybody's sister Emily, said Betty, excited a little by the sense of the fray, I shouldn't want to be yours. Now, Betty, don't be hateful, interposed Rosalie, laughing, and her laugh was nervous. There's Mina Thalberg coming up the front space. Go and meet her. Rosalie, poor girl, always found herself nervous when Sir Nigel and Betty were in the room together. She instinctively recognized their antagonism and was afraid Betty would do something an English baronet would think vulgar. Her simple brain could not have explained to her why it was that she knew Sir Nigel often thought New Yorkers vulgar. She was quite aware of this but perfectly concealed fact, and felt a timid desire to be explanatory. When Bettina marched out of the room with her extraordinary carriage finally manifest, Rosie's little laugh was propitiatory. You mustn't mind her, she said. She's a real splendid little thing, but she's got a quick temper. It's all over in a minute. They wouldn't stand that sort of thing in England, said Sir Nigel. She's deucedly spoiled, you know. He detested the child. He disliked all children, but this one awakened in him more than mere dislike. The fact was, though Betty herself was wholly unconscious of the subtle truth, the as yet undeveloped intellect which later made her a brilliant and captivating personality vaguely saw him as he was, an unscrupulous, sordid brute, as remorseless an adventurer and swindler in his special line as if he had been engaged in drawing false checks and arranging huge jewel robberies instead of planning to entrap into a disadvantageous marriage a girl whose gentleness and fortune could be used by a blackguard of reputable name. The man was cold-blooded enough to see that her gentle weakness was of value because it could be bullied. Her money was to be counted on because it could be spent on himself, and his degenerate vices be rebuilt and restocked in an early date by someone or other, lest they tumbled into ignominious collapse which could not be concealed. Yeah, I don't think Lord Grantham was a degenerate, so they may have written that a little differently than maybe what how this author saw things. Just wanted to inject that little side note there. Bettina of the accursing eyes did not know that in the depth of her yet crude young being, instinct was summing up for her the potentialities of an unusually fine specimen of the British blackguard, but this was nevertheless the interesting truth. While later she was told that her sister had become engaged to Sir Nigel Anstruthers, the flame of color flashed over her face. She stared silently a moment, then bit her lip and burst into tears. Well, Bet, exclaimed Rosalie, you are the queerest thing I ever saw. Bettina's tears were an outburst, not a flow. She swept them away passionately with her daughter unless he anticipates deriving some advantage from the alliance. Such a man, being of Anne Struthers' type, would not have married a rich woman even in his own country without making sure that advantages were to accrue to himself as a result of the union. In England, to use his own words, there was no nonsense about it. Women's fortunes as well as themselves belonged to their husbands, and a man who was master in his own house could make his wife do as he chose. He had seen girls with money managed very satisfactorily by fellows who held a tight rein and were not moved by tears and did not allow talking to relations. If he had been desirous of marrying and could have afforded to take a penniless wife, there were hundreds of portionless girls ready to thank God for a decent chance to settle themselves for life, and one need not stir out of one's native land to find them. But Sir Nigel had not in the least desired to saddle himself with a domestic encumbrance. In fact, nothing would have induced him to consider the step if he had not been driven hard by circumstances. His fortunes had reached a stage where money must be forthcoming somehow from somewhere. He and his mother had been living from hand to mouth, so to speak, for years, and they had also been obliged to keep up appearances, which is sometimes embittering even to persons of amiable tempers. Lady Anne Struthers, it is true, had lived in the country as niggardly a manner as possible. She had narrowed her existence to absolute privation, presenting at the same time a stern, bold front to the persons who saw her, to the insufficient staff of servants, to the village, to the vicar and his wife, and the few far distant neighbors who perhaps over a year drove miles to call or leave a card. She was an old woman sufficiently unattractive to find no difficulty in the way of limiting her acquaintances. The unprepossessing wardrobe she had gathered in the passing years was remade again and again by the village dressmaker. She wore dingy old silk gowns and appalling bonnets and mantles dripping with rusty fringes and bugle beads, but these mitigated not in the least the unflinching arrogance of her bearing or the simple intolerant rudeness which she considered proper and becoming in persons like herself. She did not, of course, allow that there existed many persons like herself. That society rejoiced in this fact was but the stamp of its inferiority and folly. While she pinched herself and harried her few hirelings at Stornham, it was necessary for Sir Nigel to show himself in town and present as decent an appearance as possible. His vanity was far too arrogant to allow of his permitting himself to drop out of the world to which he could not afford to belong. That he should have been forgotten or ignored would have been intolerable to him. For a few years he was invited to dine at good houses and got shooting and hunting as part of the hospitality of his acquaintances. But a man who cannot afford to return hospitalities will find that he need not expect to avail himself of those of his acquaintances to the end of his career unless he is an extremely engaging person. Sir Nigel Anne Struthers was not an engaging person. He never gave a thought to the comfort or interest of any other human being than himself. He was also dominated by the kind of nasty temper which so reveals itself when let loose that its owner cannot control it, even when it would be distinctly to his advantage to do so. Finding that he had nothing to give in his suit to nice little silly Rosalie Vanderpool. But the whole thing was unexpectedly disappointing, and surrounded by irritating circumstances, he found himself face to face with a state of affairs such as he had not contemplated. In England, when a man married, certain practical matters could be inquired into and arranged by solicitors. The amount of the prospective bride's fortune, the allowances and settlements to be made, the position of the bridegroom with regard to pecuniary matters. To put it simply, a man found out where he stood and what he has to gain. But, at first to his sardonic entertainment and later to his disgusted annoyance, Sir Nigel gradually discovered that in the matter of marriage, Americans had an ingenious tendency to believe in the sentimental feelings of the parties concerned. The general impression seemed to be that a man married purely for love, and that delicacy would make it impossible for him to ask questions as to what his bride's parents were in a position to hand over to him as a sort of indemnity for the loss of his bachelor freedom. And Struthers began to discover this fact before he had been many weeks in New York. He reached the realization of its existence by processes of exclusion and inclusion, by hearing casual remarks people let drop, by asking roundabout and careful questions, by leading both men and women to the innocent expounding of certain points of views. Millionaires, it appeared, did not expect to make allowances to men who married their daughters. Young women, it transpired, did not in the least realize that a man should be liberally endowed in payment for assuming the duties of a husband. If rich fathers made allowances, they made them to their daughters themselves, who disposed of them as they pleased. In this case, of course, Sir Nigel privately argued with fine acumen. It became the husband's business to see that what his wife pleased should be what most agreeably coincided with his own views and conveniences. His most illuminating experience had been the hearing of some men, hard-headed rich stockbrokers with a vulgar sense of humor, enjoying themselves quite uproariously one night at a club over a story one of them was relating an unsatisfactory German son-in-law who had demanded an income. He was a man of small title who had married the narrator's daughter, and after some months spent in his father-in-law's house, had felt it proper that his financial position should be put on a practical footing. He brought her back after the bridal tour to make us a visit, said the storyteller, a sharp-featured man with a quaint, wry mouth which seemed to express a perpetual repressed appreciation of passing events. I had nothing to say against that, because we were all glad to see her home, and her mother had been missing her. But weeks passed, and months passed, and there was no intention made of them going over to settle in the slosh we'd heard so much of, and in time it came out that the slosh thing, and Struthers realized with gall in his soul that the brute, as he called him, meant schloss, and that his mispronunciation was at once a matter of humor and derision. Wasn't his at all, it was his elder brother's. The whole lot of them were counts, and not one of them seemed to own a dime. The slosh account added more than 25 cents, and he wasn't the kind to deal any of it out to his family. So Lily's count would have to go clerking in a dry goods store if he promised to support himself, but he didn't propose to do it. He thought he'd gone on to a softer thing. Of course, we're an easy-going lot, and we should have stood him if he had been a nice fellow, but he wasn't. Lily's mother used to find her crying in her bedroom, and it came out by degrees that it was because Adolphe had been quarreling with her and saying sneering things about her family. When her mother talked to him, he was insulting. Then bills began to come in, and Lily was expected to get me to pay them, and they were not the kind of bills a decent fellow calls on another man to pay. But I didn't tell her that they gave an older chap than himself sidelights on the situation, but that didn't work well. He thought I did it because I had to, and he began to feel free and easy about it, and didn't try to cover up his tracks so much when he sent in a new lot. He was always working Lily. He began to consider himself master of the house. He intimated that a private carriage ought to be kept for them. He said it was beggarly that he should have to consider the rest of the family when he wanted to go out. When I got on to the situation, I began to enjoy it. I let him spread himself for a while just to see what he would do. Good Lord, I couldn't have believed that any fellow could have thought any other fellow could be such a fool as he thought I was. He went perfectly crazy after a month or so and ordered me shout and patronized me as if I was a bootblack he meant to teach something too. So at last, I had a talk with Lily and told her I was going to put an end to it. Of course she cried and was half frightened to death, but by that time he had ill-used her so that she only wanted to get rid of him. So I sent for him and had a talk with him in my office. I led him on to saying all that he had on his mind. He explained to me what a condescension it was for a man like himself to marry a girl like Lily. He made a dignified, touching picture of all the disadvantages of such an alliance and all the advantages they ought to bring in exchange to the man who bore up under them. I rubbed my head and looked worried every now and then, and cleared my throat apologetically just to warm him up. I can tell you that fellow felt happy, downright happy, when he saw how humbly I listened to him. He positively swelled up with hope and comfort. He thought I was going to turn out well, real well. I was going to pay up just as a vulgar New York father-in-law ought to do, and thank God for the blessed privilege. Why, he was real eloquent about his blood and his ancestors and the hoary-headed slosh. So when he'd finished, I cleared my throat in a nervous, ingratiating kind of way again, and I asked him kind of anxiously what he thought would be the proper thing for a base-born New York millionaire to do under the circumstances, what he would approve of himself. Sir Nigel was disgusted to see the narrator twist his mouth into a sweet, shrewd, repressed grin, even as he expectorated into the nearest receptacle. The grin was greeted by a shout of laughter from his companions. "What did he say, Stebbins?" someone cried. "He said," explained Mr. Stebbins deliberately, "he said that an allowance was the proper thing. He said that a man of his rank must have resources, and that it wasn't dignified for him to have to ask his wife or his wife's father for money when he wanted it. He said an allowance was what he felt he had a right to expect, and then he twisted his mustache and said, 'What proposition did I make? What would I allow him?'" The storyteller's hearers evidently knew him well. Their laughter was louder than before. "Let's hear the rest, Joe. Let's hear it." "Well," replied Mr. Stebbins almost thoughtfully, "I just got up and said, well, it won't take long for me to answer that. I've always been fond of my children, and Lily is rather my pet. She's always had everything she wanted, and she always shall. She's a good girl, and she deserves it. I'll allow you." The significant deliberation of his drawl could scarcely be described. "I'll allow you just 5 minutes to get out of this room before I kick you out, and if I kick you out of the room, I'll kick you down the stairs, and if I kick you down the stairs, I shall have got my blood comfortably warmed up, and I'll kick you down the street, and round the block, and down to Hoboken, because you're going to take the steamer there, and go back to the place you came from. To the slosh thing, or whatever you call it. We haven't a damned bit of use for you here. And believe it or not, gentlemen," looking round with the wry-mouthed smile, "he took that passage, and back he went, and Lily's living with her mother, and I mean to hold on to her." Sir Nigel got up and felt the club when the story was finished. He took a long walk down Broadway, gnawing his lip and holding his head in the air. He used blasphemous language in intervals in a low voice. Some of it was addressed to his fate, and some of it to the vulgar mercantile coarseness and obtuseness of other people. "They don't know what they're talking of," he said. "It is unheard of. What do they expect? I never thought of this. Damn it, I'm like a rat in a trap." It was plain enough that he could not arrange his fortune as he had anticipated when he decided to begin to make love to little pink and white, tall-faced Rosie Vanderpool. If he began to demand monetary advantages in his dealing with his future wife's people and their settlement of her fortune, he might arouse suspicion and inquiry. He did not want inquiry either in connection with his own means or his past manner of living. People who hated him would be sure to crop up with stories of things better left alone. There were always meddling fools ready to interfere. His walk was long and full of savage thinking. gauche, inexperienced, in the wrong. When he was safely married, he could pave the way to what he felt was the only practical and feasible end. If he had been marrying a woman with more brains, she would be more difficult to subdue, but with Rosalie Vanderpool, processes were not necessary. If you shocked, bewildered, or frightened her with accusations, sulks, or sneers, her light, innocent head was set in such a whirl that the rest was easy. It was possible, upon the whole, that the thing might not turn out so infernally ill, after all, supposing that it had been Bettina who had been the marriageable one. Appreciating to the full the many reasons for rejoicing that she had not been, he walked out in a gloomy reflection home. When the marriage took place, the event was accompanied by an ingeniously elate flourish of trumpets. Miss Vanderpool's frocks were multitudinous and wonderful, as also her jewels purchased at Tiffany's. She carried 1,000 trunks, more or less, across the Atlantic. When the ship steamed away from the dock, the wharf was like a flower garden in the blaze of brilliant and delicate attire worn by the bevy of relatives and intimates who stood waving their handkerchiefs and laughingly calling out farewell good wishes. Sir Nigel's mental attitude was not a sympathetic or admiring one as he stood by his bride's side looking back. If Rosie's half-happy, half-tearful excitement had left her the leisure to reflect on his expression, she would not have felt it encouraging. "What a deuce of a row Americans make," he said, even before they were out of hearing of the voices. "It will be a positive rest to be in a country where the women do not cackle and shriek with laughter." He said it with that simple rudeness which at times professed to be almost impersonal, and which Rosalie had usually tried to believe was the outcome of a kind of cool British humor. But this time she started a little at his words. "I suppose we do make more noise than English people," she admitted a second or so later. "I wonder why." And without waiting for an answer, someone as if she had not expected or quite wanted one, she leaned a little farther over the side to look back, waving her small, fluttering handkerchief to the many still in tumult on the wharf. She was not perceptive or quick enough to take offense, to realize that the remark was significant and that Sir Nigel had already begun as he meant to go on. It was far from being his intention to play the part of an American husband, who was plainly a creature in whom no authority vested itself. Americans let their women say and do anything, and were capable of fetching and caring for them. He had seen a man run upstairs for his wife's wrap, cheerfully, without the least apparent sense that the service was the part of a footman if there was one in the house, a parlour maid if there was not. Sir Nigel had been brought up in the good early Victorian days, when a nice little woman to fetch your slippers for you figured in certain circles as domestic bliss. Girls were educated to fetch slippers as retrievers were trained to go into the water after sticks, and terriers to bring back balls thrown for them. The new Lady Anstruthers had it supervened several opportunities to obtain a new view of her bridegroom's character before their voyage across the Atlantic was over. At this period of the slower and more cumbrous weaving of the shuttle, the world had not yet awakened even to the possibilities of the ocean greyhound. An Atlantic voyage at times was premonition of the wanting of the honeymoon at least, and especially if they were not sea-proof, to wish wearily that the first half of it were over. Rosalie was not weary, but she began to be bewildered. As she had never been a clever girl or quick to perceive, and had spent her life among women indulging American men, she was not prepared with any precedent which made her situation clear. The first time Sir Nigel showed his temper to her, she simply stared at him, her eyes looking like those of a puzzled, questioning child. Then she broke into her nervous little laugh, because she did not know what else to do. At his second outbreak, her stare was rather startled, and she did not laugh. Her first awakening was to an anxious wonderment concerning certain moods of gloom, or what seemed to be gloom, to which he seemed prone. As she lay in her steamer chair, he would at times march stiffly up and down the deck, apparently aware of no other existence than his own, his features expressing a certain clouded resentment of whose very unexplainableness she secretly stood in awe. She was not astute enough, poor girl, to leave him alone, and when with innocent questionings she endeavored to discover his trouble, the greatest mystification she encountered was that he had the power to make her feel that she was in some way taking a liberty, and showing her lack of tact and perspicuity. "Is anything the matter, Nigel?" she asked at first, wondering if she were guilty of silliness in trying to slip her hand into his. She was sure she had been when he answered her. "No," he said chillingly. "I don't believe you are happy," she returned. "Somehow you seem so different." "I have reasons for being depressed," he replied, and it was with a stiff finality which struck a note of warning to her, signifying that it would be better taste in her to put an end to her simple efforts. She vaguely felt herself put in the wrong, and he preferred that it should be so. It was the best form of preparation for any mood he might see that it might pay him to show her in the future. He was, in fact, confronting disdainfully his disposition. He had her on his hands, and he was returning to his relations with no definite advantage to exhibit as the result of having married her. She had been supplied with an income, but he had no control over it. It would not have been so if he had not been in such straits that he had been afraid to risk his chance by making a stand. To have a wife with money, a silly, sweet temper, and no will of her own was, of course, better than to be penniless, head over heels in debt, and hemmed in by difficulties on every side. He had seen women trained to give in to anything rather than be bullied in public, to accede in the end to any demand rather than endure the shame of a certain kind of scene made before servants, and a certain kind of insolence used to relatives and guests. The quality he found most maddeningly irritating in Rosalie was her obviously absolute non-consciousness of the fact that it was entirely natural and proper that her resources should be in her husband's hands. He had indeed, even in these early days, made a tentative effort or so in the form of a suggestive speech. He had given her openings to give him an opening to put things on a practical basis, but she had never had the intelligence to see what he was aiming at, and he had found himself almost floundering ungracefully in his remarks, while she looked at him without a sign of comprehension in her simple, anxious blue eyes. The creature was actually trying to understand him and could not. That was the worst of it. The blank wall of her unconsciousness, her childlike belief that he was far too grand a personage to require anything. These were the things he was thinking over when he walked up and down the deck in unamiable solitariness. Rosie awakened to the amazed consciousness of the fact that instead of being pleased sitting in her stateroom enfolded in a dressing gown covered with cascades of lace, tied with knots and embroidered ribbon, and her maid, Hannah, who admired her greatly, was brushing her long hair with a gold-backed brush, ornamented with a monogram of jewels. If she had been a French duchess of a piquant type or an English one with an aquiline nose, she would have been beyond criticism. If she had been a plump, overfed woman or an ugly, ill-natured, gross one, she would have looked vulgar, but she was a little thin, fair New Yorker, and though she was not beyond criticism, if one demanded high distinction, she was pretty and nice to look at. But Nigel Anstruthers would not allow this to her. His own tailor's bills being far in arrears, and his pocket disgustingly empty, the sight of her ingenious sumptuousness and the gay, accustomed simpleness of outlook with which she accepted it as her natural right, irritated him and roused his venom. Bills would remain unpaid if she was permitted to spend her money on this sort of thing without any consideration for the requirements of other people. He inhaled the air and made a gesture of distaste. "This sachet business is rather overpowering," he said. "It is the sort of thing a woman should be particularly discreet about." "Oh, Nigel," cried the poor girl agitatedly. "Hannah, do go and call the steward to open the windows. Is it really strong?" she implored as Hannah went out. "How dreadful. It's only Oris, and I didn't know Hannah had put it in the trunks." "My dear Rosalie," with a wave of the hand, taking in both herself and her dressing case, "it is all too strong." "All what?" gaspingly. "The whole thing, all that lace and love-knot arrangement, the gold-backed brushes and scent bottles with diamonds and rubies sticking in them. They were wedding presents. They came from Tiffany's. Everyone thought them lovely. They look as if they belonged to the dressing table of a French woman of the demi-monde. I feel as if I had actually walked into an apartment of some notorious Parisian soubrette." Rosalie Vanderpool was a clean-minded little person. Her people were of the clean-minded type. Therefore, she did not understand all that this ironic speech implied, but she gathered enough of its significance to cause her to turn first red and then pale and then burst into tears. She was crying and then trying to conceal the fact when Hannah returned. She bent her head and touched her eyes furtively while her toilette was completed. Sir Nigel had retired from the scene, but he had done so feeling that he had planted a seed and bestowed a practical lesson. He had, it is true, bestowed one, but again she had not understood its significance and was only left bewildered and unhappy. She began to be nervous and uncertain about herself and about his moods and points of view. She had never been made to feel so at home. Everyone had been kind to her and lenient to her lack of brilliancy. No one had expected her to be brilliant, and she had been quite sweet-temperedly resigned to the fact that she was not the kind of girl who shone either in society or elsewhere. She did not resent the fact that she knew people said of her, "She isn't in the least bit bright, Rosie Vanderpool, but she's a nice, sweet little thing." She had tried to be nice and sweet and aspired to nothing higher, but now that seemed so much less than enough. Perhaps Nigel ought to have married one of the clever ones, someone who would have known how to understand him and who would have been more entertaining than she could be. Perhaps she was beginning to bore him. Perhaps he was finding her out and beginning to get tired. At this point, the always too ready tears would rise to her eyes, and she would be overwhelmed by a sense of homesickness. Often she cried herself silently to sleep, longing for her mother, her nice, comfortable, ordinary mother, whom she had several times felt Nigel had some difficulty in being unreservedly polite to, though he had been polite on the surface. By the time they landed, she had been living under so much strain in her effort to seem quite unchanged that she had lost her nerve. She did not feel well and was sometimes afraid that she might do something silly and hysterical in spite of herself. Begin to cry, for instance, when there was really no explanation for her doing it. But when she reached London, the novelty of everything so excited her that she thought she was going to be better. And then she said to herself it would be proved to her that all her fears had been nonsense. This return of hope made her light-spirited, and she was almost gay in her little outbursts of delight and admiration as she drove out the streets with her husband. She did not know that her ingenious ignorance of things he had known all his life, her rapture over common monuments of history, led him to say to himself that he felt housemaid to see a Lord Mayor's show. Before going to Stornham Court, they spent a few days in town. There had been no intention of proclaiming their presence to the world, and they did not do so, but unluckily certain tradesmen discovered the fact that Sir Nigel Anstruthers had returned to England with the bride he had secured in New York. The conclusion to be deduced from this circumstance was that the particular moment was a good one at which to send in bills for account rendered. The tradesmen quite shared Anstruthers' point of view. Their reasoning was delightfully simple, and they were wholly unaware that it might have been called gross. A man over his head and years in debt naturally expected his creditors would be paid by the young woman who had married him. America had in these days been so little explored by the thrifty, impecunious, well-born, that its ingenious sentimentality in certain matters was by no means comprehended. By each post, Sir Nigel received numerous bills. Sometimes letters accompanied them, and once or twice respectful but firm male persons brought them by hand and demanded interviews, which irritated Sir Nigel extremely. Given time to arrange matters with Rosalie, to train her to some sense of her duty, he believed that the account rendered could be wiped off. But he saw he must have time. She was but such a little fool. Again and again he was furious at the fate which had forced him to take her. The truth was that Rosalie knew nothing whatsoever about unpaid bills. Reuben Vanderpool's daughters had never encountered an indignant tradesman in their lives. When they went into stores, they were received with unfeigned rapture. Everything was dragged forth to be displayed to them. Attendants waited to leap forth to supply their smallest behest. They knew no other phase of existence than the one in which one could buy anything one wanted and pay any price demanded for it. Consequently, Rosalie did not recognize signs which would have been obviously recognizable by the initiated. If Sir Nigel Anstruthers had been a nice young fellow who had loved her, and he had been honest enough to make a clean breast of his difficulties, she would have thrown herself into his arms and implored him effusively to make use of all her available funds, and if the supply had been insufficient, would have immediately written to her father for further donations, knowing that her appeal would be responded to at once. But Sir Nigel Anstruthers cherished no sentiment for any other individual than himself, and he had no intention of explaining that his mere vanity had caused him to mislead her, that his rank and estate counted for nothing, and that he was in fact a pauper, loaded with dishonest debts. He wanted money, but he wanted it to be given to him as if he conferred a favor by receiving it. It must be transferred to him as though it were by his right. What did a man marry for? Therefore his wife's unconsciousness that she was inflicting outrage upon him by mere mental attitude filled his being with slowly rising gall. Poor Rosalie went joyfully forth shopping after the manner of all newly arrived Americans. She bought new toilettes and gewgaws and presents for her friends and relations in New York, and each package which was delivered at the hotel added to Sir Nigel's rage. That the little blockhead should be allowed to do what she liked with her money, and that he should not be able to forbid her. This he said to himself at intervals of 5 minutes through the day, which led to another small episode. "You are spending a great deal of money," he said one morning to his in his condemnatory manner. Rosalie looked up from the lace flounce which had just been delivered and gave the little nervous laugh which was becoming entirely uncertain of propitiating. "Am I?" she answered. "They say all Americans spend a good deal. Your money ought to be in proper hands and properly managed." He went on with cold precision. "If you were an Englishwoman, your husband would control it, would he?" The simple, sweet-tempered obtuseness of her tone was an infuriating thing to him. There was the usual shade of troubled surprise in her eyes as they met his. "I don't think men in America ever do that. I don't believe the nice ones want to. You see, they have such a pride about always giving things to women and taking care of them. I believe a nice American man would break stones in the street rather than take money from a woman, even his wife. I mean, while he could work. Of course, if he was ill and had ill luck or anything like that, he wouldn't be so proud as to not take it from the person who loved him most and wanted to help him. You do sometimes hear of a man who won't work and lets his wife support him, but it's very seldom, and they are always the low kind that other men look down on." Wanted to help him. Sir Nigel selected the phrase and quoted it between puffs of the cigar he held in his fine, rather cruel-looking hands, and his voice expressed a not too subtle sneer. faltered weakly. She knew she was offended again and that she was once more somehow in the wrong. So many things about her seemed to displease him, and when he was displeased, he always reminded her that she was stupidly, objectionably guilty of not being an Englishwoman. Whatsoever it happened to be the fault that she had committed out of her depth of ignorance, he did not forget it. It was no habit of his to endeavor to dismiss offenses. He preferred to hold them in possession as if they were treasures, and to turn them over and over in the mental seclusion which nourishes the growth of injuries, since within its barriers there is no chance of their being palliated by the apologies of explanations of the offender. During their journey to Stornham Court the next day, he was in one of his black moods. Once in the railway carriage, he paid small attention to his wife, but sat rigidly reading his Times until about midway to their destination. He descended at a station and paid a visit to the buffet in the small refreshment room, after which he settled himself to doze in an exceedingly unbecoming attitude. His travelling cap pulled down, his rather heavy face congested with the dark flush Rosalie had not yet learned was due to the fact that he had hastily tossed off 2 or 3 whiskies and sodas. Though he was never, either thick of utterance or unsteady on his feet, whiskey and soda formed an important factor in his existence. When he was annoyed or dulled, he at once took the necessary precautions against being overcome by these feelings, and the effect upon a constitutionally evil temper was to transform it into an infernal one. The night had been a bad one for Rosie. Such floods of homesick longing had overpowered her that she had not been able to sleep. She had risen feeling shaky and hysterical, and her nervousness had been added to by her fear that Nigel might observe her and make a comment. Of course, she told herself it was natural that he should not wish her to appear at Stornham Court looking a pale, pink-rosed little fright. Her efforts to be cheerful had indeed been somewhat touching, but they had met with small encouragement. She thought the green-clothed country lovely as the train sped through it, and a lump rose in her small throat because she knew she might have been so happy if she had not been so frightened and miserable. The thing which had been dawning upon her took a clearer, more awful form. Incidents she had tried to explain and excuse to herself upon all sorts of futile, simple grounds began to loom up before her in something like their actual proportions. She had heard of men who had changed their manner towards girls after they had married them, but she did not know they had begun to change so soon. This was so early in the honeymoon. To be sitting in a railway carriage in a corner remote from that occupied by a bridegroom who read his paper in what was obviously intentional, resentful solitude. And Emily Soames' father, she remembered it against her will, had been obliged to get a divorce for Emily after her 2 years of wretched married life. But Alfred Soames had been quite nice for 6 months at least. It seemed as if all this must be a dream, one of those nightmare things in which you suddenly find yourself married to someone you cannot bear, and you don't know how it happened because you yourself have had nothing to do with the matter. She felt that presently she must waken with a start and find herself breathing fast and panting out, half laughing, half crying, "Oh, I'm so glad it's not true. I am so glad it's not true." But this was true, and there was Nigel, and she was in a new, unexplored world. Her little trembling hands clutched each other. The happy, light, girlish days full of ease and friendliness and decency seemed gone forever. It was not Rosalie Vanderpool who pressed her colorless face against the glass of the window, looking out at the flying trees. It was the wife of Nigel Anstruthers, and suddenly, by some hideous magic, she had been snatched from the world to which she belonged, and was being dragged by a gaoler to a prison which she did not know how to escape. Already Nigel had managed to convey to her that in England a woman who was married could do nothing to defend herself against her husband, and that to endeavor to do anything was the last impossible touch of vulgar ignominy. Vivid realization of the situation seized upon her like a possession as she glanced sideways at her bridegroom and hurriedly glanced away again with a little hysterical shudder. New York, good-tempered, lenient, free New York, was millions of miles away, and Nigel was so loathly near and so ugly. She had never known before that he was so ugly, that his face was so heavy, his skin so thick and coarse, and his expression so evilly ill-tempered. She was not sufficiently analytical to be conscious that she had, which with one bound leaped to the appalling point of feeling uncontrollable physical abhorrence. realization that there were certain expressions of his countenance which made her feel sick with repulsion. Her self-reproach was also as great as her terror. He was her husband, and she was a wicked girl. She repeated the words to herself again and again, but remotely she knew when she said, "He is my husband," that was the worst thing of all. This inward struggle was a bad preparation for any added misery, and when their railroad journey terminated at Stornham Station, she was met by new bewilderment. The station itself was a rustic place where wild roses climbed down a bank to meet the very train itself. The station master's cottage had roses and clusters of lilies waving in its tiny garden. The station master, a good-natured, red-faced man, came forward, baring his head to open the railroad carriage door with his own hand. Rosie thought him delightful and bowed and smiled sweet-temperedly to him and to his wife and little girls who were curtsying at the garden gate. She was sufficiently homesick to be actually grateful to them for their air of welcoming her, but as she smiled, she glanced furtively at Nigel to see if he was doing exactly the same thing. He himself was not smiling and did not unbend even when the station master, who had known him from his boyhood, felt at liberty to offer a deferential welcome. "Happy to see you home with her ladyship, Sir Nigel," he said. "Very happy, if I may say so." Sir Nigel responded to the respectful amiability with a half-military lifting of his right hand, accompanied by a grunt. "Day two, Wells," he said, and strode past him to speak to the footman who had come from Stornham Court with the carriage. The new and nervous little Lady Anne Struthers, who was left to trot after her husband, smiled again at the ruddy, kind-looking fellow, this time in conscious deprecation, and the simplicity of her republican sympathy with a well-meaning fellow creature who might feel himself snubbed. She could have shaken him by the hand. She had even parted her lips to venture a word of civility when she was startled by hearing Sir Nigel's voice raised in angry rating. "Damned bad management not to bring something else," she heard. "Kind of thing you fellows are always doing." She made her way to the carriage, flurried again by not knowing whether she was doing right or wrong. Sir Nigel had given her no instructions, and she had not yet learned that when she was in a certain humor, there was an equal fault in obeying or disobeying such orders as he gave. The carriage from the court, not in the least a new or smart equipage, was drawn up from the entrance of the station, and Sir Nigel was in a rage because the vehicle brought for the luggage was too small to carry it all. "Very sorry, Sir Nigel," said the coachman, touching his hat 2 or 3 times in his agitation. "Very sorry. The omnibus was a little out of order at the springs, Sir Nigel, and I thought—" "You thought," was the heated interruption. "What right had you to think, damn it? You are not paid to think. You are paid to do your work properly. Here are a lot of damned boxes which ought to go with us, and where's your maid?" Wheeling round upon his wife, Rosalie turned towards the woman who was approaching from the waiting room. "Hannah," she said timorously, "drop those confounded bundles, order Sir Nigel, and show James the boxes her ladyship is obliged to have this evening. Be quick about it, and don't pick out half a dozen. The cart can't take them." Hannah looked frightened. This sort of thing was new to her. She shuffled her packages onto a seat and followed the footman to the luggage. Sir Nigel continued reading the coachman. Any form of violent self-assertion was welcome to him at any time, and when he was irritated, he found it a distinct luxury to kick a dog or throw a boot at a cat. The springs of the omnibus, he argued, had no right to be broken when it was known that he was coming home. His anger was only added to by the coachman's halting endeavors in his excuses to feel a fact he knew his master was aware of, that everything in Stornham was more or less out of order, and that dilapidations were the inevitable result of there being no money to pay for repairs. The man leaned forward on his box and spoke at last in a low tone. "The bus has been broken some time," he said. "It's an expensive job, Sir Nigel. Her ladyship thought it better to—" Sir Nigel turned white about the mouth. "Hold your tongue," he commanded, and the coachman got red in the face, saluted, biting his lips, and sat very stiff and upright in his box. The station master edged away uneasily and tried to look as if he were not listening, but Rosalie could see that he could not help hearing, nor could the country people who had been passengers by the train, and who were collecting their belongings and getting into their ignored and remained standing while the scene went on. She could not help recalling the manner in which she had been invariably received in New York on her return from any journey, how she was met by comfortable, merry people and taken care of at once. This was so strange, it was so queer, so different. Oh, never mind, Nigel dear, she said at last with innocent indiscretion. It doesn't really matter, you know. Sir Nigel turned upon her a blaze of haughty indignation. If you'll pardon my saying so, it does matter, he said. It matters confoundedly. Be good enough to take your place in the carriage. He moved to the carriage door and not too civilly put her in. She gasped a little for breath as she sat down. He had spoken to her as if she had been an impertinent servant who had taken a liberty. The poor girl was bewildered to the verge of panic. When he had ended his tirade and took his place beside her, he wore his most haughtily intolerant air. May I request that in future you will be good enough not to interfere when I am reproving my servants, he remarked. I didn't mean to interfere, she apologized tremulously. I don't know what you meant. I only know that what you did, was his response. You American women are too fond of cutting in. An Englishman can think for himself without his wife's assistance. The tears rose to her eyes. The introduction of the international question overpowered her as always. Don't begin to be hysterical, was the ameliorating tenderness with which he observed the 2 hot salt drops which fell to spite her. I should scarcely wish to present you to my mother, bathed in tears. She wiped the salt drops hastily away and sat for a moment silent in the corner of the carriage. Being wholly primitive and unanalytical, she was ashamed and began to blame herself. He was right. She must not be silly because she was unused to things. She ought not to be disturbed by trifles. She must try to be nice and look cheerful. She made an effort and did not speak for a few minutes. When she recovered herself, she tried again. English country is so pretty, she said when she thought she was quite sure that her voice would not tremble. I do so like the hedges and the darling little red-roofed cottages. It was an innocent tentative at saying something agreeable which might propitiate him. She was beginning to realize that she was continually making efforts to propitiate him, but one of the forms of unpleasantness most enjoyable to him was the snubbing of any gentle efforts at palliating his mood. He condescended in this case no response whatsoever, but merely staring contemptuously before him. It is so picturesque and so unlike America, was the pathetic little commonplace she ventured next. Ain't it, Nigel? He turned his head slowly towards her, as if she had taken a new liberty in disturbing his meditations. What? He dawdled. It was almost too much for her to sustain herself under. Her courage collapsed. I was only saying how pretty the cottages were, she faltered, and that there's nothing like this in America. You ended your remark by adding, ain't it? Her husband condescended. There's nothing like that in England. I shall ask you to do me the favor of leaving Americanisms out of your conversation when you are in the society of English ladies and gentlemen. It won't do. I didn't know I said it, Rosie answered feebly. That is the difficulty, was his response. You never know, but educated people do. There was nothing more to be said, at least for a girl who had never known what it was to be bullied. This one felt like a beggar or a scullery maid who, being rated by her master, had not the refuge of being able to give warning. She could never give warning. The Atlantic Ocean was between her and those who had loved and protected her all her short life, and the carriage was bearing her onwards to the home in which she was to live alone as this man's companion to the end of her existence. She made no further propitiatory efforts, but sat and stared in simple blackness at the country, which seemed to increase in loveliness at each new point of view. Sometimes she saw sweet wooded rolling lands made lovelier by the home farmhouses and cottages, enclosed and sheltered by thick hedges and trees. Once or twice they drove past a park enfolding a great house guarded by its huge sentinel oaks and beeches. Once the carriage passed through an adorable little village where children played on the green, and a square-towered grey church seemed to watch over the step-roofed cottages and creeper-covered vicarage. If she had been a happy American tourist traveling in company with impressionable friends, she would have broken into ecstatic little exclamations of admiration every 5 minutes, but it had been driven home to her that to her present companion, to whom nothing was new, her rapture would merely represent the crudeness which had existed in contentment in a brownstone house on a noisy thoroughfare, though through a life which had been passed tramping up and down numbered streets and avenues. approached at last a second village with a grass-grown street, and the irregular red-tilled cottages, which to the unaccustomed eye seemed rather to represent studies for sketches than absolute realities. The bells in the church tower broke forth into a chime, and people appeared at the doors of the cottages. The men touched their foreheads as the carriage passed, and the children made bobbing curtsies. Sir Nigel condescended to straighten himself a trifle in his seat and recognized the greetings with the stiff half-military salute. The poor girl at his side felt that he had put as little feeling as possible into the movement, and that if she herself had been a bowing villager, she would almost have preferred to be wholly ignored. She looked at him questioningly. Must I, she began. Make some civil recognition, answered Sir Nigel, as if he were instructing an innocent and ignorant child. It is customary. So she bowed and tried to smile, and the joyous clamor of the bells brought the awful lump into her throat again. It reminded her of the ringing of the chimes at the New York church on that day of her marriage, which had been so full of gay, luxurious bustle, so crowded with wedding presents and flowers and warm-hearted, affectionate congratulations and good wishes, uttered in merry American voices. The park at Stoneham Court was large and beautiful and old. The trees were magnificent, and the broad sweep of sward and the rich dip of Ferndale all that the imagination could desire. The court itself was old and many-gabled and mellow, red and fine. Rosalie had learned from no precedent as yet that houses of its kind may represent the apotheosis of discomfort and dilapidation within, and only become more beautiful without. Tumble-down chimneys and broken tiles, being clambered over by tossing ivy, are pictures to delight the soul. As she descended from the carriage, the little girl was tremulous and uncertain of herself, and much overpowered by the unbending air of the manservant who received her as if she were a parcel in which it was no part of his duty to take the smallest interest. As she mounted the stone steps, she caught a glimpse of broad gloom within the threshold, a big square dingy hall where some other servants were drawn up in a row. She had read of something of the sort in English novels, and she was suddenly embarrassed afresh by a realization of the fact that she did not know what to do, and if she made a mistake, Nigel would never forgive her. An elderly woman came out of a room opening into the hall. She was an ugly woman of rigid carriage, which, with the obvious intention of being severely majestic, was only antagonistic. She had a flaccid chin and was curiously like Nigel. She had also his expression when he intended to be disagreeable. She was the Dowager Lady Anne Struthers, and being an entirely revolting old person at her best, she objected extremely to the transatlantic bride who had made her a dowager, though she was determinedly prepared to profit by any practical benefit likely to accrue. "Well, Nigel," she said in a deep voice, "here you are at last." This was, of course, a statement not to be refused. She held out a leathern cheek, and as Sir Nigel also presented his, their caress of greeting was a singular and not effusive one. "Is this your wife?" she asked, giving Rosalie a bony hand, and as he did not indignantly deny this to be the fact, she added, "How do you do?" Rosalie murmured a reply and tried to control herself by making another effort to swallow the lump in her throat, but she could not swallow it. She had been keeping a desperate hold on herself too long. The bewildered misery of her awakening, the awkwardness of the public row at the station, the sulks which had filled the carriage to repletion, through all the long drive, and finally the jingling bells which had so recalled that last joyous day at home, had brought her to a point where this meeting between mother and son, these two stony, unpleasant creatures exchanging a reluctant rub of uninviting cheeks, as two savages might have rubbed noses, proved the finishing impetus to hysteria. They were so hideous, these two, and so ghastly comic and fantastic in their unresponsive glumness, that the poor girl lost all hold upon herself and broke into a trembling shriek of laughter. "Oh," she gasped in terror at what she felt to be her indecent madness. "Oh, how?" And then, seeing Nigel's furious start, her mother's glare, and all the servants' alarmed stare at her, she rushed staggering to the only creature she felt she knew, her maid Hannah, clutched her and broke down into wild sobbing. "Oh, take me away," she cried. "Oh, do take me away, oh Hannah. Oh, mother, take your mistress to her room," commanded Sir Nigel. "Go downstairs," he called out to the servants. "Take her upstairs Struthers was half led, half dragged, in humiliated, hysteric disorder up to the staircase. He took his mother by the elbow, marched her into the nearest room, and shut the door. There they stood and stared at each other, breathing quick, enraged breaths, and looking particularly alike, with their heavy-featured, thick-skinned, infuriated faces. It was the dowager who spoke first, and her whole voice and manner expressed all she intended that they should, all the derision, dislike, and scathing resignment to a grotesque fate. "Well," said her ladyship, "so this is what you have brought home.